Dr. Chantal Perrot is a family physician, psychotherapist, and a member of the board of Dying with Dignity. She joins me from Toronto. Dr. Perrot, thanks for your time today. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Look, I'll get in a moment to what the politicians are saying today about the court ruling on medically assisted death and how they react to it. But can you start by telling me why you think the judge in Quebec got it right? What's wrong with the laws on medically assisted death as they are currently written?
Well, I think there are a lot of patients who are deemed not eligible for an assisted death because their deaths aren't deemed to be reasonably foreseeable. And so there's a lot of suffering that goes on for a lot of patients. And the Quebec decision in changing that will make a huge difference to a lot of my patients.
What's been the effect, if you can tell me a little more, of the law? Who's been excluded from applying for the procedure, and what has that meant for them in terms of the some of the suffering you say a lot of them have been meant to endure?
Well, patients who are on a clear trajectory towards death, where their diagnoses, their illness, their conditions is ultimately going to result in their death, and they're currently suffering in a lot of either pain physically or psychologically and emotionally, and could expect to continue to suffer for quite a number of years. So there's been varying interpretations of the legislation in terms of reasonably foreseeable, with some physicians looking at it being closer to an imminent death as is required in Quebec, as I understand it, to others who, with the AB decision in Ontario, have expanded their finding of reasonably foreseeable to a number of years. So it's been an unequal and unfair distribution of that across the country. And for these patients who could last for quite a number of years, their suffering is very intolerable for a long period of time.
So both the Liberals and the NDP today are saying the ruling shouldn't be appealed, that they would change the law to expand access and satisfy the Quebec court ruling. Although it's not clear exactly how, but so maybe you can help us out. What needs to be done to address the concerns of dying with dignity and others?
Well, I think the ruling needs to be looked at again from the point of view of the patient's perspective and the patient's suffering. If a patient is on a clear trajectory towards death and their condition is going to cause their death, then their death can be seen as reasonably foreseeable, and we don't need to have that criterion in the legislation. I think part of it is being able to trust MAID assessors and providers to make that clinical determination. And it is a clinical determination. It's going to be made on a case-by-case basis. And removing the criterion from the legislation will make it more fair and more equitable for patients across the country, and will make it a bit easier for clinicians to find that the patients are eligible to receive an assisted death when they are suffering.
The Conservative leader, Andrew Scheer, is saying today that, look, he would appeal the ruling so that the Supreme Court of Canada could provide certainty to politicians and lawmakers on how to proceed to make sure that they get the changes right, but still protect vulnerable Canadians. How do you feel about that position?
I disagree. I think that the vulnerability of the patients has to be protected by the clinicians who are assessing them. And there are safeguards in the legislation which would still stand. And I think safeguards that physicians would put into their own practices, which would help to protect the vulnerable patients while not discriminating against the patients who are suffering and should be found eligible. Okay.
So I guess, how do you see next steps here in terms of a certain amount of urgency to this? I mean, there are certain deadlines hanging over all of this on how to proceed legally and so on. And we are in the midst of an election campaign. So what's your message to the political leaders?
Change the law, and change it soon.
That simple. All right, Dr. Perrot, thanks so much for your time today. I do appreciate it.
Thank you.